In 2012, a farmer in Nebraska bought a $300,000 tractor, then watched it sit dead in his field because the software inside it belonged to John Deere. He couldn't fix it. His mechanic couldn't fix it. Nobody could touch it without a dealer's authorization code. A machine he legally owned had become property he wasn't allowed to repair. This is unpriced risk. Everything made sense, right up until it didn't. That farmer's frustration would eventually find its way to Gay Gordon-Byrne's desk and set off a legal war nobody saw coming. Not because it's dangerous, not because it requires a medical license or a reactor clearance, because the manufacturer decided that only their authorized repair network, a legal arrangement, not a safety standard, could touch the device without voiding your warranty or triggering a software lockout. A cracked iPhone screen, spiderweb fracture across the corner, totally functional otherwise. The repair quote from an unauthorized shop, $150. The phone's resale value on the secondhand market, $80. So you either pay twice what the thing is worth to fix it, or you throw it away. That's not an accident. That's a business model. Farmers were hitting the same wall. John Deere tractors, equipment that costs more than most houses, locked behind proprietary diagnostic software that only dealer technicians could access. A broken sensor during harvest could cost a farmer an entire season's income because the nearest authorized technician was 3 days out. 3 days while the crop just sits there. Gay Gordon-Byrne watched all of this and made it her fight. The question she kept putting to whoever would listen was pretty blunt, actually. If you paid for it, why don't you own it? That question turns out to be worth billions of dollars to the people who'd prefer you never thought to ask. The repair shops were dealing with the symptom. What Gay Gordon-Byrne gradually uncovered, digging through corporate filings and licensing agreements, was the architecture underneath. A genuine Apple screen, pulled from a real iPhone, manufactured by Apple, functionally identical to the one in your broken phone, will be rejected by your device if a technician installs it without running Apple's proprietary software to pair the component's serial number to your specific unit. The part is real, the part works, the software says no. Apple called the internal diagnostic tool that performs this pairing the Horizon machine, and they didn't make it available to independent repair shops. Not for safety reasons, not for any technical reason a third-party engineer couldn't solve. It simply wasn't offered. John Deere took a different route to the same destination, buried in the end-user license agreement for their tractors. Equipment a farmer might pay $300,000 for is language clarifying that the farmer licenses the software inside the machine. They don't own it. You can own the steel and the engine and the cab. The code that makes it run is still John Deere's. The word license was doing a lot of work in that contract. By the early 2020s, Apple's services division, the umbrella that includes repair revenue, App Store fees, and extended warranty programs, was clearing more than $20 billion annually. $20 billion annually. That number does a lot of explaining. Maybe not everything, but close enough. The product you bought isn't really the product. It's a delivery system for a subscription to permission. Permission to use it. Permission to fix it. Permission that can be repriced or revoked at any time. Gordon-Byrne had been saying this in hearing rooms for years. The numbers were finally starting to agree with her. The architecture Gay Gordon-Byrne was mapping didn't appear overnight. It was built on a law passed in 1998, years before the iPhone existed, years before a farmer would need software just to diagnose a tractor. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act was written to stop people from pirating movies and music. Nobody in that congressional hearing room was thinking about refrigerator firmware, but Section 1201 of that law made it a federal offense to circumvent any digital lock-protecting copyrighted software, and every device a manufacturer sold now ran copyrighted software. That's the door they walked through. Gordon-Byrne spent years doing something genuinely unglamorous, reading state repair bills line by line, driving to Capitol buildings to testify, then packing up and doing it again in the next state. She mapped this fight legislature by legislature, over 20 states by the mid-2010s, and what she kept finding was the same opposition, with the same language, reading from what was, in several cases word for word, the same script. Manufacturer-funded coalitions with names invoking security and privacy showed up in hearing rooms from Nebraska to Massachusetts, warning that repair bills would expose consumers to data theft and safety risks. The testimony was nearly identical across states. Those coalitions weren't spontaneous. None of that lobbying was even necessary to make the legal threat real. An independent shop that bypassed a software lock to run diagnostics could be sued under DMCA Section 1201, not for stealing, not for counterfeiting, for reading code, like a library that could prosecute you for opening the wrong book. Manufacturers could void warranties if customers used unauthorized shops, and the authorized dealer network, tightly controlled, trained on proprietary tools, became the only legally safe place to get a repair done. Kyle Wiens at iFixit understood this clearly. His public teardowns of new devices the day they launched weren't just content, they were deliberate provocation, publishing repair information that manufacturers considered proprietary, daring them to invoke the DMCA, testing exactly where the legal line actually sat. Gordon-Byrne was watching all of it, taking notes. It took years before anyone else started paying attention, and even then, not for the reasons she expected. By the early 2020s, the world was generating more than 50 million metric tons of electronic waste every year, the fastest growing waste stream on Earth. Not hazardous chemicals, not agricultural runoff, phones, laptops, tablets, devices that still worked, or could have, if anyone had been allowed to fix them. Nobody was saying it directly, but that wasn't an accident. Look at the actual engineering decisions. Glued batteries, proprietary screws that no standard toolkit can open. Circuit boards where memory, storage, and processor are fused together so tightly that one failed component condemns the entire device. Each of those choices required extra effort to implement. A removable battery is actually easier to manufacture than a glued one, and modularity is older than the iPhone. These weren't shortcuts. They were deliberate departures from designs that were, by any engineering standard, simpler and easier to build. Someone had to sign off on every single one of them. That's not speculation. That's how product development works. The math isn't complicated. A $29 battery replacement can extend a phone's usable life by 2 to 3 years. A new device costs roughly $1,000. Manufacturers need you to buy the second thing, on a predictable cycle baked into revenue forecasts as a number shareholders expect to see hit. Planned obsolescence isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a line item. The European Commission eventually put a number on what consumers actually wanted. 77% of EU citizens said they'd prefer to repair their devices rather than replace them. 77%. And they couldn't, not because repair is technically too difficult, but because the devices had been engineered to make it nearly impossible, and the parts and software required were locked behind walls that only manufacturers controlled. You'd handed over $1,000. What you walked out with was conditional access. The landfill numbers kept climbing, the business model kept working, and Gordon-Byrne kept showing up to hearings because the data was finally catching up to everything she'd been saying for years. The question was whether lawmakers would catch up too. While the landfill numbers were still climbing, something else was shifting, quieter, slower, playing out in the carpeted hallways of state legislatures rather than on factory floors. Gay Gordon-Byrne had spent over a decade watching lawmakers' eyes glaze over when she talked about repair. Consumer convenience, she'd argue, access to parts, fair pricing, and legislators would nod politely and do absolutely nothing. Then she changed the word. Not repair, ownership. The question she started putting to legislators wasn't, shouldn't people be able to fix their stuff? It was sharper than that. When you hand over $1,000 for a phone, what exactly did you buy? Because here's what manufacturers had quietly built into the legal architecture around their products. You bought the physical object, the glass, the aluminum, the battery, but the software running it, the diagnostic tools needed to service it, the right to decide who opens it, they kept all of that. You paid in full and walked out owning something that was, in a very real legal sense, still partly theirs. The physical object was yours. The right to decide what happened inside it, that stayed with them. That one word changed who would actually take the meeting. Property rights is a different conversation than consumer convenience. It lands differently in a room full of people who ran on small government platforms and genuinely believe ownership means something concrete. In 2021, the Federal Trade Commission made it official. Their report, Nixing the Fix, found explicitly that manufacturer repair restrictions harm consumers, and that no credible safety or quality justification exists for them. Not hedged, not qualified. The safety argument, the one manufacturers had leaned on for years across dozens of state hearings, didn't survive contact with the FTC's own investigation. And then New York moved. The Digital Fair Repair Act, signed in 2022, the first meaningful state right-to-repair law in the country. The frame shift had worked. Politically, it had actually worked. But the fight was far from finished. By 2022, the state-by-state fight Gay Gordon-Byrne had waged for over a decade was starting to show results, slowly, unevenly, but visibly. 2 years later, the European Union passed its right-to-repair directive, requiring manufacturers of phones, tablets, and household appliances to provide parts, tools, and repair information for up to 10 years after a product goes on sale. It's the most sweeping repair legislation passed anywhere in the world, and it arrived because the argument Gordon-Byrne had spent years making, that repair restrictions are a claim of ownership, not a safety policy, had crossed the Atlantic and found real traction in Brussels. Apple responded before the directive even landed. In 2022, the company launched its self-repair program, making parts and tools available directly to consumers. It was framed as a concession. The parts, it turned out, cost nearly as much as sending the device to an Apple depot for repair. Make of that what you will. And the parts pairing logic that locked iPhone components to specific serial numbers has since spread well beyond phones. Modern vehicles contain more than 100 software-controlled modules, and an independent mechanic replacing a steering column on certain models now triggers a software lockout. The car simply won't recognize the part as legitimate. During COVID-19, hospitals trying to repair ventilators found that manufacturers had locked the diagnostic software. Machines were sitting in wards, technically fixable, while patients were waiting for beds. Those machines were fixable. Nobody was authorized to touch them. Nobody sat in a room and planned this. The pressure all pointed one way, across phones, cars, medical equipment, and home appliances, and nobody got paid to push back. It didn't need coordination. That was the design. The cracked screen from the beginning of this story is still cracked. The repair quote came back higher than the owner expected. They're still deciding. The manufacturer already counted it as a sale. Thanks for watching Unpriced Risk. See you soon.